Welcome to the first in our LeaderShift Laboratory webinar series in which we are exploring navigating complexity. It's great to see so many of you are interested in this topic and are able to join us today. My name is David Senior and I'm from the Centre for Workplace Leadership, and it's my great pleasure to be the host of this 9-part webinar series. I'd firstly like to extend a very warm welcome to our very special first guest, Renner. Welcome, Diana. Diana is the Director of the Not Knowing Lab and Uncharted Leadership, which are international consulting practices focused on building the capacity and the capability of organisations and individuals to navigate uncertainty and complexity. Diana is also the co-author of Not Knowing, The Art of Turning Uncertainty into Opportunity, with Stephen D'Souza, which was the winner of the UK's Chartered Management Institute Book of the Year for 2015, or as I like to call it, the Management Booker. Congratulations, Diana, on that one. As well as being an author, a teacher, a facilitator and a coach, Diana has professional experience in the fields of law, strategy, communications, refugee advocacy and leadership development, and has taught on a range of leadership programs, including as a faculty member with Harvard University's JF Kennedy School of Government. So it's with great pleasure that we have Diana here today to help us navigating complexity. Before we start, a little bit of context. This webinar is part of the Centre for Workplace Leadership's online leadership capability assessment and learning platform called LeaderShift. This is based on research which identifies 9 capabilities for effective workplace leadership, and this is at any level and across any sector. These 9 capabilities are under 3 dimensions of people, strategy and execution, although we don't recommend executing people as a strategy. We'll be covering a different capability in each of the 8 remaining webinars over the next 8 months. And for more information, you can go to leadership.org.au/capabilities. I'm going to ask Diana a few oriented questions to get the ball rolling, but then we want to throw over to you and we want to get your questions as well. So feel free to type your questions into the question box there, or if you would like to engage with a wider audience, you can also tweet your questions as well. So you can tweet to @leadingatwork using the hashtag LeaderShift Lab. And if we don't get to your questions straight away, we'll definitely endeavour to get to your question at some stage during the course of the webinar. We'll also aim to finish at bang on 2:30 as well. So in the spirit of this being a laboratory, we're going to experiment. We're going to take some risks. We're going to test some hypotheses. We're going to be creative. We're going to be curious. We might possibly fail, but we hope that in this whole, as this plays out, that we do contribute some small amount to the quantum of human knowledge on what navigating complexity is. So as we don our metaphorical lab coats, we put on our safety goggles. Diana, my first question to you is about you and how you actually arrived at being interested in helping people navigate complexity, because I know you've got a really interesting personal story. So perhaps you could kick us off by telling us a bit about that.
Well, my story started back in Romania in the early 70s, where I was born. As you would know from history, Romania was a very closed-off totalitarian dictatorship, a communist country that was actually one of the last countries in Eastern Europe to open up to the more democratic ways of governing post the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I grew up in an interesting time in Eastern Europe. My parents felt quite unsafe towards the end of the 80s, and as a family, we fled Romania. It's probably its worst, in the worst period of those communist years. So we ended up overnight with a few bags, crossing the border into Hungary, seeking refuge through the Red Cross in Austria, and spending 1 year really in limbo, not knowing basically what was going to be happening to us, where we will end up. Luckily, we ended up in Australia, and I recovered a little bit of my lost teenagehood. I went to school and university and so on. So I guess my interest in the unknown and in not knowing stems from that very dramatic experience of leaving everything behind, everything familiar, and finding myself in literally an unknown territory. Being 16, turning 17, that was a formative time for me in my life. And I think I've carried that through to today. So I think I've drawn on that experience no matter where I found myself from a personal or career point of view. And I think I've also through that period of time, I've forged a little bit of resilience towards uncertainty. And I have been able to navigate some of the more difficult challenges in my life with a bit of confidence that I could face the unknown and not only survive, but thrive. So through my careers, I've changed different professions. I've exercised that muscle even more. So now I feel like it's through this book, I find there is an opportunity to share my experience and my passion for helping other people navigate the unknown.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like you really have embodied that sense of uncertainty and being able to deal with complexity.
Well, it's a work in progress, I think. I don't think anyone can actually fully master the unknown. I know paradoxically, even though I've written a book about the unknown, I'm very much still learning about it every day and still practicing what I preach. So, but it's very much a work in progress for any of us.
So from your experience and from them working with other people to help them navigate complexity, what do we mean by complexity? What's your definition of it?
Definitions are by their very nature quite limiting. I draw on various sources for inspiration when I think about complexity. The first one is a widening complexity to think about, thinking about VUCA, the acronym that the military uses in describing highly volatile, so V for volatile, highly uncertain, U for uncertainty, C for complexity, and A for ambiguity. So VUCA world is how I like to describe the high level of uncertainty, unpredictability that we're facing in today's workplaces and in our lives. I also like a definition that Dave Snowden, who is the creator of the Cynefin framework, he talks about complexity as a place which is characterized by flux, by unpredictability. It's the unknown unknowns that we experience in our world, in our work, in our lives. So Dave Snowden distinguishes complex challenges from complicated challenges. He has a great way of actually distinguishing what we often think about as challenges that we might be able to bring our expertise and apply our expertise in a useful way. He distinguishes those which he calls complicated, things that challenges or problems or situations where our expertise can be quite useful, and that's the domain of the experts. That is really not the same as complex challenges or contexts which are potentially unknowable. There is a different way of approaching those complex challenges, that complexity, which require a different way of responding, different way of basically showing up in the first place, and where our expertise is no longer useful. It's actually potentially even limiting. Yeah, so it's really hard to define what the problem is in the first place, let alone find an answer.
Right. And is there you mentioned that with complexity there's a potential to not ever know. When does that tip over into complete chaos? Like there still must be some sense of, when we're dealing with complexity, some boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave Snowden distinguishes complex challenges from chaotic situations, which are characterized by high turbulence. So those are the crises that we experienced, for example, in the September 11 attacks, or the more recent attacks in Paris, or in Australia, where we experienced bushfires. They are highly chaotic, highly turbulent contexts where, again, the response mechanism that we need to employ is not the same as in the complex or the complicated domains.
Diana, we hear a lot about the notion of agility and adaptability being important for leading in complexity. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what agile and adaptable leadership might look like.
Well, adaptive leadership is something that I'm quite passionate about. It's a model that was developed at Harvard University more than 30 years ago by Professor Ronald Heifetz, and it was joined later on by Martin Linsky. So adaptive leadership draws on biology, where organisms that find themselves in unfamiliar or different territory, so as a result potentially of increased temperature or the context shifting, those organisms are forced to adapt. They adapt by shedding part of their DNA. They shed their DNA that is no longer useful, and they maintain the part of their DNA that is precious and useful for them in that new context. So that is a great metaphor for adaptability. First of all, because adaptation takes place over a very long period of time. So for us in our workplaces where we're trying to bring about change, to think about leadership as an activity that we do over a long period of time. It's actually having the patience and the resilience to actually see it through, and rather than applying just a sort of a quick fix to something that is not potentially not solvable, like culture. So taking a long-term approach. And so adaptability is that ability to see things through, to also of the openness to make mid-course corrections. I find that sometimes we have a plan and we hold on to it really tightly. We know what we want to get out of an intervention, a strategy, or a plan that we put in place, and we hold it so tightly, we don't actually pay attention to things that happen along the way that could derail us or give us better information in terms of what is actually going on. So that ability to hold things lightly and to make mid-course corrections as more data becomes available is a really important skill to have. The more unknown the situation, the more that is required of us. And the third thing around adaptive leadership is that capacity to really try to understand what is going on before taking action. So we often have this propensity to jump into solution mode, to jump into action very quickly, and we are rewarded for doing that by our workplaces. So our workplaces put a high premium on getting to the answer quickly, being decisive. Adaptive leadership proposes that actually the more complex the challenge we have, the slower we need to take it, the more time we need to spend in understanding the dynamics of the challenge, in diagnosing the why before going into the what next.
Right, thank you. And in relation to agility, I mean, is there a type of organisation or a situation that is more able to be adaptive? I'm thinking, a lot of us are working in large organisations, which is quite difficult to be agile. Adaptation is very slow, but there's also that need to sometimes move quickly as well. And I wonder whether how you keep that tension of those two capacities.
To move fast and to move slow?
Yeah.
Well, I think I would say, in addition to VUCA, I would add P, the paradox. And I think it's one of those requirements in today's workplace, and to actually embrace paradox, so to embrace the both and. So rather than seeing it as an either or, it's actually how can we actually hold both and. So in terms of your question, we can both hold a plan, both have a plan, and be able to let go of the plan. Have I understood the question correctly?
Yeah? That's very good. It kind of links quite nicely to the next question, which I want to set up is another paradox, which is your expertise in not knowing, which, as we've said, is a contradiction in terms. But
yes.
I thought we could actually talk a little bit about the concept of not knowing, and we actually have a little activity that we'd like to get our participants to do now. This is a little video. It goes for 4 minutes. It's based on some content from Diana's book, and it's just poses a few questions for you to think about yourself on not knowing and your relationship to knowledge and how that both enables and impedes you as well. So, Jake, if we could throw that video, that would be great.
Perhaps a little caution is in order. When was the last time someone tried to sell you something with so many benefits, but no downsides? The problem with knowledge is in the very fact that it is so useful. We cling to it even in situations where it has the potential to limit us. It gets in the way of new learning and growth. One of the prime dangers of knowledge is that we turn to experts in domains of knowledge and expect them to know. We can also abdicate our responsibility, give away our power. The reality is that the very thing that enables people to become experts and contribute to their own field, their deep knowledge and specific focus of research, may also limit their perspective. The reality is that we're all facing the unknown every day in our personal and work lives and have very little control over what happens next. There are no well-worn paths and no guides to show us the way. In this dynamic complexity and interconnection that we live in, no easy answer are possible. We are unable to define the most complex challenges we face, let alone solve them. I don't know are the three most dangerous words in business. In the research for our book, Stephen and I spoke to many managers who struggled with not knowing. They feared looking stupid in front of their team or their peers, their manager. They feared losing their authority or letting people down. They worried about losing people's trust or respect and being seen as incompetent. When we step into a new space, when we're faced with the unexpected or the inconsistent or the inexplicable, we inevitably come to the edge of our confidence and our competence. In Roman times, when the map of the world was still being drawn, blank areas represented the unexplored vastness, contained the words, "Here be dragons." This it was to warn explorers of the potential risks and dangers. There are many risks and dangers at the edge, and many unwanted and unconscious reactions that we can experience. It's right at that edge with the unknown where we confront our own uncertainties, fears, and anxieties. When we reach that edge, our common default responses may be a tendency to get busy, or to work harder, to attempt quick fix solutions or look for even more information. Many of our responses are simply extensions of old ways of tackling issues. We inevitably stick with what we know because it's so much more comfortable. If we can begin to accept that our old ways are no longer useful, then we can begin to open up and find new ways of living and leading at the edge. Not knowing is that space, that in-between space, where we can come to the edge, feel uncertain and afraid, but potentially open up. There is a rich tradition of people out there who feel very comfortable in this in-between space, even thrive in it. These are our scientists, our entrepreneurs, our artists and adventurers, people from a diverse range of professions that embrace the possibility available in this space. Back in 1817, John Keats, an English poet, talked about Shakespeare and a trait that he really admired in Shakespeare about being able to be in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without irritable reaching after fact and reason. This capability of Shakespeare, Keats called negative capability. Negative capability is a really powerful idea because it captures the need for making space in the mind to allow new thoughts, new learning. to appear. It clears the mind of existing knowledge or existing assumptions, and it captures the paradox that making space is a capability. It is a skill that some people have, but they can also be learned and fostered. So when Keats talks about negative capability, he talks about things like waiting, silence, doubt, patience, and humility. Those are the capabilities that we don't usually associate with leadership, but that are becoming increasingly important in this modern day and age.
If you're not knowing then about Zen practices. Diana, I just wanted to pick up on the negative capabilities. Could you tell us a bit more about that? I think it's a really interesting idea. I love the fact that you've quoted Keats there as well.
Yes, I was really intrigued by the quote when I came across it, and the whole notion that a capability can be negative, and that's really in line with our book. So what does negative capability actually mean? It's negative because it's not actually valued in our workplaces. It's not because it's bad or it's not useful. On the contrary, that is something really powerful around the notion that the counterintuitive skills of waiting, of patience, of slowing down, of doing nothing actually are really useful in this space of uncertainty and not knowing. So positive capabilities will always be useful and will always need to be developed alongside, we argue, those negative capabilities. And what you saw there, just starting talk about the beginner's mind. So that's one of the negative capabilities of actually opening up to what is experienced and looking at perceiving reality, looking at things with fresh eyes, with beginner's eyes. Just like a child brings curiosity to something they're doing for the first time, or just as a traveller might, see a place they've never explored before with fresh eyes. We encourage leaders to bring that beginner's mind into their work and their challenges. I find that intriguing. It's hard to sell negative capability. Maybe we should find another word for it, but certainly that's what the book focuses on.
It is hard to sell, and I'm just trying to think in terms of, a practical situation where perhaps a manager or even a new person entering a role for the first time is fostering that capability. How do they do that, given that the culture is that this is not the sort of thing you do? I mean, you've got the tension of doubt and competence, and if your competence is brought into question, it puts you on shaky ground, doesn't it?
It does. I think it's really hard when you're starting in a new job. If you're managing people and if you have people reporting into you and people looking to you for your expertise, it's also hard because people are dependent on people further higher up to make decisions or to be decisive. So for me, I think it's really important to create that, to renegotiate those expectations. Whether you're starting in a new job or whether you're managing a team of people, how do you renegotiate the expectations that are placed on you? Rather than entering into that situation, accepting it as it is, how do we start having those conversations around, when are we allowed to ask questions, or how can we create the space actually to ask questions? How do we open up the space, physical space? Where are we having those conversations? If we're really interested in bringing curiosity into our meetings, and leading with more questions, for example, than answers, can we create the space, the physical space for doing that? So not having those meetings in the same place where we're having budgeting discussions, or so really setting it up from a physical point of view, from an expectations point of view, and authorizing people to not know. So there is a level of authorization that is required in our workplaces. Otherwise, we'll just revert back to a very strong pull to look like we know what we're doing, even when we don't.
Does that have to come from the top? Like if that's not endorsed at that level, that capacity to not know, then can it still be implemented at other levels?
Yes, I think so. I think that curiosity put to good use will be ultimately rewarded. I think people who ask good questions can actually help us all think. So that can come from any level in an organization. It doesn't have to be formalized per se, but I think that if it's not encouraged from the top, it's really hard to sustain it. Yeah, it's really, I think it's hard to sustain it. The best questions come from people who actually step into a role fresh, and it's that curiosity around, how do you do things here? Can actually help us all think more better about situations which we take for granted. It's that familiarity that we all suffer from in situations where we tend to bypass useful information because it's already so familiar to us. It's like driving down the road that you always do, and you end up to your destination and you wonder, how did I get there? You stop paying attention. It's all automatic. So we have to bring fresh eyes onto our challenges so that we don't go into automatic mode of thinking and doing and problem solving.
So getting away from that traditional, it's the way we've always done things.
Yes. So actually having a new person come in asking stupid questions is the best thing we could do in that situation.
Great.
Yeah.
Keep the questions coming, people. We've got a couple here, but I'm just going to hold off on just a second because I think we'll cover that. Gianna, I just wanted to ask you in relation to actually being able to develop these capabilities further. Do you have any suggestions for how people can actually develop the capacity to navigate complexity, to embrace not knowing more?
Yeah, I have a few ideas, and there's been some interesting research done in the States recently by the Center for Creative Leadership, which points to some conditions that need to be fostered in workplaces to encourage people to develop that capacity to embrace or better navigate complexity and uncertainty. There are three conditions. It's really around how do you grow people's minds rather than just provide them with more information. And it's really important, so I'll say it again, how do we grow people's minds rather than provide them with more information? It's like actually the difference between having a cup and pouring more water in a cup until it overflows versus having a cup and actually making the cup itself bigger, the container bigger. So that requires a different way of approaching learning and development in the workplace. How do we create the opportunities for people to expand their sense-making, their ability to make sense of the situations, the new challenges they're facing? So there are three conditions. The first one is that inevitably learning comes outside of our comfort zone. So we need to create heat. By that I mean taking people really taking them outside of their comfort zone into unfamiliar situations, challenging tasks, projects, putting someone who has never done a particular task before in charge of that task or project. Google is famous for taking one of the most junior people in their team and putting them in charge of something quite complex and difficult. So it's really trusting people that they will have everything they need at their disposal in order to raise to the occasion. And it's only in those situations where, like myself, when I was totally taken out of my day-to-day, that you can actually grow and exercise that muscle. So creating enough support for people, but not actually protecting them too much from the discomforts of not knowing, uncertainty. So giving challenging tasks to people and trusting them that they will get there, rather than just providing them with more information. Yeah. So that's the first one, heat. As Heifetz likes to say, you can't cook without heat. So you need a little bit of heat, but obviously not too much so you burn the pot. Not a little, that's when nothing happens. Yeah. So in addition to having those heat experiences, how do we create situations where we have colliding perspectives on an issue? The colliding perspectives is really important because I think we often have, we all have a tendency to look for people who agree with us. We seek rather than people who disagree or are likely to challenge us. So opening up the space in those meetings or those situations where we can actually bring different perspectives in on an issue is very healthy to understand not only where people are coming from, but really to get different angles on something that is still unknown. So colliding perspectives, and often you hear of people, bosses, or you've got undercover boss to the extreme. But how do you create opportunities for people to step in other people's shoes, in your customers' shoes, in your stakeholders' shoes, to spend a day in a different office? Or that's the second condition. And the third condition is elevated sense making. And by that, I mean where we have the opportunity to create, to reflect on what we've done post-action reflection. How do we make sense of what we've engaged with and what's happened and what role we've played? So that sense making can happen by yourself with a notebook, or we can happen with someone else who can shed light on, provide a different perspective, provide that container, safe container for that conversation. So people who have mentors, they really greatly benefit from that learning. So that sweet spot of creating vertical development, as it's called, where you're enlarging people's capacity, making their minds practically bigger, happens at the intersection of those three conditions.
That's really helpful, Diana. Thank you. We do have a question. It's a slightly tricky one, I think, and it picks up your earlier reference to adaptation from a biological perspective.
Yes.
So feel free to say, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's a great question. How do leaders identify the DNA to shed? I can't read the rest of it, but I think it's enough there. So
yeah,
you mentioned before you have to know
what is core to the agency. Yeah. So that's a really tricky question, and that's one that we can all experience ourselves. So when we move into a new situation or a new space, we need to identify what no longer serves us well in that new situation. So it's a process of discovery, it's a process of reflection. If it's happening at the personal level, there is no manual on how to go through that process, and it can take a very long time. What is precious that is serving us well in a new situation needs to be discovered, as well as what needs to be shed. So for me personally, when it's taken me a long time to get here, it's taken me a very long time to be in a position where I pursue something that I'm really passionate about. I've had a lot of professions, I've gone through a lot of professions in the past, because my thing that was holding me back was my need to meet what I thought were the expectations of my parents. Having lost everything, having moved countries, having come here, like many children of migrants, I felt the need to, do well and do more and do all those things that I felt were really important. So I needed to let go of that in order to pursue my dream and my passion. So it took me a long time. So it's a long process, and it was having to bump up against different jobs that I wasn't fulfilled in, having to experience disappointments and failures in order to actually come to that realization. So I'm afraid I don't have the formula for that, but it's a process of reflection and paying attention to what happens to us, what works and what doesn't work. It's a process of experimentation.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that personal story. This is a question about practical suggestions for creating opportunities for staff to engage and participate in change where there is resistance, conflict, whether it's group or one-on-one.
Yeah. So this is really, I think this is a really good question, and it's I'm interested in that because to me, the first thing that we do when there is change, especially if it's advocated by management, is that it's actually sold, the positives are being sold to or promoted internally. So we always sell or promote or communicate the upsides of change, and we potentially underestimate the loss that is associated with that change for people. So I would say that before we engage people and try to engage them in the positives of change or a change project, how do we really understand what is at stake for people? What are the losses that people are likely to face or are fearing or assuming they're facing as a result of that change? And it can be loss of privilege, loss of status, loss of power, loss of influence, could be monetary losses, loss of face. So it's really paying attention, really investigating that, because I think when we advocate change, if we can actually speak to that loss as a first stage, as a first step, I think people are more likely to trust and to feel understood, and then to move to transition into that next phase. The resistance doesn't come from the change itself. It comes from people's fear of loss and people's assumptions around what they need to let go of. So once that resistance is dealt with by facing into the loss, then I think we can also look at the benefits of change and set up some opportunities for people to experience it. And the other thing is around the transition. So putting in place a transition rather than sort of today we're here, tomorrow we're over there. How do we actually take into account that change takes place? It needs to take place over a longer period of time. People need space to adjust, and there's a transition. There's a transition that needs to be factored in.
Great, thank you. That's a great question and a great response too. Thanks, Diane. Perhaps we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. How can organisations create conditions for adaptive leadership? Seen them try and fail because conditions not right. Okay, so someone who's had experience with implementing adaptive leadership before and hasn't worked. So
that is similar to the question before. I think it's important to set the context right, and authority. People in positions of authority, people we call leaders, have a really important role to play. I think that the conditions need to be authorised and led by from the top, as well as supported by throughout the organisation. So yes, there's often failure because the conditions are not right. It's hard to know exactly what situation you're referring to here, but the making the space for people to grieve the loss, for people to also discuss what is important to them, and to develop people's capacity alongside the change, the project or the change initiative. How do we develop people's capacity to work adaptively? I think it's a learning and development opportunity in organisations to encourage people to work adaptively, and that is to approach those problems or those challenges with an open mind, to spend more time diagnosing a problem rather than jumping into solutions. If we spend more time in our meetings talking about what is really going on here, why are we actually facing this challenge before we actually go into problem-solving mode, that's the condition necessary for us slowing down, trying to understand, setting in place the processes for going deeper into the challenge before jumping into solution mode. The other thing that I think we need to take into account is creating the space for experimentation. Again, it's, do we have the right conditions in place for taking risks, for allowing people, authorizing people to take risks and to fail? What is our relationship to failure? So it's not big failures, but could we set in place some small experiments on the edges of our work, where we can learn new things about what we're tackling and our challenges, and to have then the ability to gain more data on what's happening. So I would say try to really understand the problem better, and part of that is really having a healthier relationship, a more robust relationship with experimentation and failure.
That's a great answer. I always find that the notion of mistakes, and we talk a lot now about this permission to fail.
Yes.
But I guess, and I love the quote by, I think it was Joyce, who said something about mistakes are portals of discovery.
Yes.
So, but I just wondered if this person's alluding to it being an overall failure. What is a successful failure, and what is a failure that we need to write off and just leave aside? I'm just wondering how you kind of know when you're just a serial maker of mistakes as opposed to someone who's actually learning from that process along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a serial.
Speaking from personal experience.
A failure hurts. I've recently had quite a big failure, which was partly public, and it really hurt. And I'm still trying to work out exactly what I've learned from it. So it's never good. I mean, it's never, what I mean is it's never success. There's no such thing as successful failure. It's what you make of it and how you make sense of it afterwards. So to me, a successful, I guess if we can call it that, a successful failure is one that we can learn from. So we could stuff things up totally, but what actually can we do next time? Is it and questioning around what was the role we played, taking responsibility, but collecting more information about that situation ourselves, and then learning new things for next time. So to me, there's always an upside to failure, because you can actually learn more, find out more things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's Samuel Becker, we're going on to Irish writers here, but he said fail again, fail better. And Stan Wawrinka, the Swiss tennis player, liked it so much he had it tattooed on his arm. So there is something in that. On that note, we are almost out of time. Diana, do you have anything final you'd like to say?
I really like using so many quotes. My book is full of quotes. I love finding interesting things that shed light on this very complex topic. For me, it's actually a Spanish author, Antonio Machado. He says, "Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking." And for me, I think that encapsulates that whole process of learning, of adaptation, of actually venturing into new territory, taking one step at a time, being open to what you learn along the way, and making it course corrections if necessary. So, traveller, there is no path. The path is made by walking.
It's a lovely place to end, Diana. I think it's been a pleasure talking to you. I could keep going for another hour at least.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending today and for hanging in there. I believe we did have some technical issues earlier, which meant some people weren't getting the vision or the sound. We apologise for that, but hopefully you did get something out of today. It's definitely been worthwhile from our point of view. We will keep you posted on when the next webinar will be. It will be in late January. We haven't pinned down a specific date yet, but if you're on our mailing list, we will let you know. We have as our special guest Helga Svensson. I don't have my notes here with me, and she's looking, I think, at building relationships and collaboration, so that will be worth seeing. If you enjoyed today, please attend the next session as well, and also let anyone else know who's not on our mailing list to go on the CWL website at leadingatwork.com.au and join up to our website, so you'll be able to find out about our next webinar. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Antonia. Thank you very much, everybody. Hopefully we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.